Good morning, and welcome to the Museum of the San Ramon Valley's virtual speaker series. I am Dan Dunn, the director of the museum. Today is the fifth presentation in this series. Past presentations have included Highway 21, the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, and last month, California's First People, Then and Now. Today should be fun. We have a large audience with us. Our presentation today takes us to visit the Alamo Pioneer Cemetery. Our presenter is cemetery docent Jana Hurdle. Jana will take us on a walk through this historic cemetery and introduce us to some of the early pioneer families that are buried there. Jana has lived in Alamo for almost 30 years and raised 3 children in the San Ramon Valley School District. As an active parent volunteer with the local schools, she has fond memories of the educational programs sponsored by the Museum of the San Ramon Valley. She has participated in the museum's one-room schoolhouse program and Indian Life program that her children had attended, and was always been impressed with the way that the museum brings history to life for students and adults. And we get to do that again this morning. After her children left for college, Jana became a volunteer for the museum and was the museum's newsletter editor for 5 years. She organizes tours of the Alamo Pioneer Cemetery for the museum. Please use the chat window at the bottom of the screen for any questions that you have. Feel free to send in questions anytime during the presentation, and we'll address them at the end. And now to our presentation. It is my great pleasure to introduce Jana Hurdle. Jana?
Thank you. Good morning, and welcome to our annual Alamo Cemetery presentation. It's important to study history to give us a perspective of time and how the past relates to us in our present day. As Pearl Buck said, if you want to understand today, you have to search yesterday. And as Teddy Roosevelt said, the more we know about the past, the better prepared we are for the future. We could probably all use a little extra preparation for the coming days ahead, so let's just jump right into our history. Our local area has a rich human history dating back over 5,000 years. The Tatcan Bay Miwok Indians lived in harmony with nature here in the Alamo-Danville area for several thousand years before the Spanish explorers invaded California in 1769. We know from their diaries that they camped on the banks of our local creeks right near the cemetery in 1772. We also know that the pioneers began settling our area right around the gold rush time. So a good place to begin studying our history is at the Alamo Pioneer Cemetery. Since the museum hasn't been able to do in-person tours this year of COVID 2020, we thought it would be fun to do a virtual tour of the cemetery. So let me take you there right now. And just bear with me while I transport you there. Welcome to the Alamo Cemetery. This little treasure is tucked away on the bend of El Portal, just off of Danville Boulevard, on the border of Alamo and Danville. You've probably passed by it 1,000 times on your way to Hepnicky Park and never even given it a second thought. But it's actually a very restful and peaceful place to stroll through and admire the headstones of our pioneers who helped found this wonderful community that we live in. The cemetery was established on this gentle hill just east of the San Ramon Creek in the 1850s. The land was actually once part of a Mexican land grant that was set up in the 1830s, and for many years the exact American ownership of the land was unknown. However, we recently discovered that a community-minded pioneer named John B. Watson donated this hill to be used as a cemetery before he sold all his properties to August Hemme. in the mid-century. Long before the first burial at this cemetery, sacred Native American burial grounds were established in the downtown areas of Danville and Alamo. I remember when my kids were attending San Ramon Valley High School about 12 years ago, construction crews began demolishing the old gymnasium that was built in the 1940s and immediately discovered Native American bones beneath the old foundation, which of course halted construction for months while the bones were properly honored. At any rate, the first officially recorded pioneer burial here was that of a 6-year-old girl in 1856. But another recent discovery made through research is that the first actual burial that we know of on this knoll was a man named Thomas Monroe in 1838. He was traveling with a survey party and met with an untimely death in this area. That was long before the gold rush, when very few Americans were even traveling or even in California. So it was an interesting discovery to learn that there is an unmarked grave somewhere on this hillside. The cemetery is still very much in use today, managed by the Alamo Lafayette Cemetery District. There's no longer room for ground burial sites, except for existing family plots, but there are niches available for cremated remains, which we'll see later on the tour. When the museum conducts its live cemetery tours, we typically have museum docents dressed in pioneer costumes like this, standing at the grave sites of some of the outstanding settlers, regaling visitors with tales of olden days. But since we can't do that now, I'll just be giving you a quick overview of some of the colorful characters as we walk around the cemetery. When visiting the cemetery, as any other cemetery, it's important to explore with a certain reverence for the people who are buried here. I'm wearing typical attire for a grieving pioneer woman in the mid-1800s, so that you don't have to. You can come in your ordinary clothes. This is a fairly quiet part of town now, but 150 years ago it was fairly bustling. There were annual religious camp meetings on the riverbanks that lasted for days. Pioneer Mary Ann Jones was one of the organizers and wrote that people came from every place in reach. Another pioneer, James Smith, recalled that the meetings were full of religious fervor and included 3 daily services, 4 or 5 wonderful exhorter preachers, and baptisms in the valley's best swimming pool, San Ramon Creek. To this day, there are several churches clustered nearby as a testament to the valley's early history. Before we head into the cemetery, I just want to mention a nearby landmark. This plaque marks the spot of the Union Academy that was established in 1858 and opened for classes in 1860. It's located on the west side of Danville Boulevard near El Portal, across from what is now the United Methodist Church. The first trustees of the school were Silas Stone, Robert Love, and John M. Jones, whose grave sites are here at the cemetery. Here's a drawing of the Union Academy. It was the largest building in the San Ramon Valley at the time and was used for a variety of gatherings in addition to education classes. Unfortunately, it burned down in 1868. Pioneer James Smith wrote about dances at the Union Academy, saying, "We played games, danced the Virginia reel, money musk, and cotillions with Reverend McClure playing the violin and instructing us in the intricacies of the different steps. At the conclusion of the dance, we were furnished a light repast. We were then asked to kneel, and our teacher would offer a prayer, after which we were dismissed. Did we love our teacher? I'll testify we did." Now, one of the first grammar schools in the valley was placed near the cemetery in 1854, even before the Union Academy. Mary Ann Jones recalled that Richard Webster was the first teacher, and one of his students reported that he was popular with the pupils. "He had good discipline, but I never knew of his punishing a pupil." Corporal punishment was definitely used in the schools back then, and it's known that at least one teacher repeatedly beat students with a tree branch. It's no wonder that Richard Webster was well liked. By the 1860s, Valley residents and visitors frequented the small downtowns of Alamo, Danville, and Limerick, which we now know of as San Ramon. There were general stores and blacksmith shops, hotels and saloons, post offices, and one-room grammar schools. Disagreements over the Civil War created tensions during those years, even way out west here, but the existence of the high school, the church, and this cemetery clustered on the Alamo-Danville border helped to gather people together and create a nurturing community for these new residents. The first family plot here belongs to the Podva family. The name Podva is recognizable to our residents today because two of their homes are well-known historic buildings in Danville. Adolphus Podva came from Canada in the 1880s. He married Mary Ann McPherson, whose family came here soon after the gold rush, crossing the plains with Buffalo Bill Party. Adolphus and Mary had 3 sons. The Podva's first house was originally built by Presbyterian minister Reverend Joshua Chase Burgess and was called Bonnie Vista, with its views of Mount Diablo and the valley. Adolphus and Mary bought the house and 20 acres where the livery and mercantile is now, and it became known as the Podva House. It was a grand dome of a house with 8 rooms, a barn, and orchards. They sold the house to one of their sons, Roger, in 1911, where it stood proudly for decades. In 1980, the house was moved and restored to the business medical offices, still located on Podva Road near the livery. Roger Podva had a butcher shop in Danville and served on the Danville Fire District Board. He married Ruby Oswell, a daughter of pioneers, and she was Danville's postmistress from 1933 to 1963, quite possibly the longest tenure of any postmaster in the area. With no home delivery, patrons came to the post office regularly, and Ruby knew everyone around. She said, "My post office was in a small brick building location on Hartz. There sure wasn't much room, but we really didn't need too much. We had 30 postal boxes and no routes. You know, I had no formal higher education, and with the government demanding and accounting for every penny, you couldn't be ahead or behind 1 cent. I hired a bookkeeper, but I caught on quickly." Plucky woman, that Ruby. Now, this is the Podva's other house, known as their townhouse. The Shuey Podva House is a Victorian Italianate built around 1891, and it still stands at the corner of School Street and Hartz Avenue. Last I saw, it was set up as an office workspace. So of course you've all heard of Daniel Boone. Well, when the Boone boys rolled into the San Ramon Valley, they brought a famous frontier name and heritage with them. James O., buried here with his wife Sally, and Wellington Boone were the great-great-grandsons of Daniel Boone, and they started Boone Farm in San Ramon, which is still in operation today. This is what you would be seeing on the live tour, a museum docent in costume regaling you with stories of the historical figures buried on the spot. James O. Boone moved to Danville in 1865 from Missouri with his wife Sally. He was one of the first trustees of Danville Grammar School. The Boones raised tomatoes, sugar beets, grain, barley, and walnuts. Not much is recorded about Wellington Boone, but he's buried on the other side of the cemetery. James and Sally's son Numa and his wife Minnie Thorne Boone of Alameda bought Forest Home Farms Ranch in San Ramon in 1900 and built a large 2-story house west of the highway. Numa was a valley leader as president of SRV Bank for a decade, in addition to raising grain and hay, managing pear and walnut orchards, and handling cattle on 1,000 acres of their own. Numa and Minnie's bright son Travis, also known as Bud, left the ranch for Southern California, perhaps with grand ambitions. He met the lovely Ruth Quayle in Hollywood, and you can see why he was quickly smitten. After a whirlwind courtship, they were married just a few weeks before the stock market crash in 1929. In later years, Ruth recalled in an interview the story of how their marriage got off to a rocky start. She and Bud decided to marry, but Ruth didn't want a large wedding since she knew her widowed mother couldn't afford it. In October of '29, they drove from Hollywood to San Ramon so that they could meet the Boone family. At Bud's initiative, they decided to get married on this trip. When they reached Merced, the couple stopped and applied for a marriage license. During their visit to Forest Home Farms, Bud's mother, Minnie Boone, made it clear to Ruth that she didn't want to see Bud married anytime soon. Nevertheless, Bud and Ruth returned to Merced and were married a few days later. According to Ruth, perhaps because their address on the license was Hollywood, the SF Chronicle announced the wedding in the paper. Local resident Winona Elworthy read it and called up the Boones to congratulate them before Bud had even contacted his family. Bud's sister called him and said, "I want to know if you're married." When he said yes, she promptly hung up on him. Ruth admitted that wasn't a very good beginning with his family. Bud's job brought him back to San Francisco, but when his father became ill and the future of Boone Ranch was in jeopardy, Bud and Ruth moved to the ranch where they lived for the rest of their lives. He saved the ranch from foreclosure during the Depression years and made the most of agricultural life as he invented and developed more efficient ways to collect and dry walnuts. Bud and Ruth also took care of his father and both of their mothers as they aged. So I guess they made up for the ill-advised wedding, all in good time. In 1997, Ruth Quayle Boone donated 16 acres of Forest Home Farm to the city of San Ramon for a park to honor her husband's agricultural contributions. Forest Home Farm's historic park focuses on the agricultural history of the San Ramon Valley. Ruth must have been an entertaining woman. Shortly after donating the farm to San Ramon, she recounted highlights of the family history, including a story of the pioneers' travels west. Ruth recalled that the cow brought to feed baby Cora died on the journey. She said, "Cora was fed from the juice from the rind of bacon. If that was going to kill you, maybe you'd already think she would have died. But she didn't. She lived to be 90, and then her sister lived to be 91. I am always amazed at the resilience of those pioneers. Right across the path is the Stone Family gravesite. Stone Valley and Stone Valley Road were named for members of the Stone family who came from Iowa and arrived in California in the 1850s. They gravitated to Moore Valley, and one stone after another purchased land in the heart of Alamo that became known as Stone Valley. Silas and Susanna Ward Stone came to California in 1853 with a large wagon train captained by their son, Albert Stone, and they settled in Alamo. Silas was tall and dignified, and he was the area's alcalde, which is a Mexican position similar to a mayor judge. Thus, he became known as Squire Stone. Their son, Albert, the wagon master, returned to California with his second wife, Martha Smith Stone, in 1858, and they raised 7 children in Alamo near Green Valley. Albert was called Colonel because of his renown as an Indian fighter back east. Albert's son accidentally set fire to the house with a candle while he was looking for something in a closet. Many things still in packing boxes were saved, but their money, in the form of gold, melted and leaked through the cracks in the floor. Fortunately, it was later recovered and minted again. Albert and Martha eventually owned 1,200 acres in Alamo with hay, grain, cattle, horses, sheep, and hogs. He was a charter member of the Danville Grange in 1873. The Stone House still stands on Austin Lane in Alamo. The Stones were strong supporters of education. Colonel Albert Stone built a cabin on his ranch to use as a school for his children and neighbors, and Silas Stone was one of the first trustees of the Union Academy. Silas and Susanna built this home in 1855, just off Stone Valley Road, where it stood for about 100 years. Now, as we head up the hill, you'll notice that the paths through the cemetery have been named after trees and flowers. We're on Oak Avenue right now, turning left on Columbine. Is the extensive Wood family plot. Members of the Wood family have been very active in the Sycamore Valley and San Ramon Valley for decades. The Wood family name is synonymous with local education, farming, and nature. This is another example of museum docents portraying historical figures buried in the cemetery. Don and Joan Kurtz entertained visitors for years as members of this prominent pioneering family. Don acted as Charles Wood and Joan was his daughter Charlotte. The real Charles and Cynthia Wood came to the Sycamore Valley in 1862. To begin with, Charles moved to California from Concord, Massachusetts in 1852 as a miner and storekeeper. Cynthia Rice came from New York and was a teacher in Yuba City. They married in 1857, had 4 children, and bought a large ranch in Sycamore Valley in 1862. They called it Woodside Ranch, and the headquarters of the ranch still exists today. Many of the ranch hills are now the Sycamore Valley Open Space Regional Park. Charles was the first worthy master of the Danville Grange, an elected assemblyman, and a county assessor. He was well known for his speeches and his promotion of good farming techniques and good citizenship. Both he and Cynthia were charter members of the Grange in 1873. This photo captures a friends and family outing at Woodside Farm in Sycamore Valley in 1895. Pioneer life was difficult, to say the least, but picnics, parades, trips to Mount Diablo, and celebrations for May Day and the 4th of July brought some festive relief to the valley's farm and ranch families. A memorable event that the Wood's daughter Charlotte wrote about occurred in 1887. Charles had gone to San Francisco with her brother Louis. Her brother Louis was returning from Davis with the grain header when a fire started in San Ramon. Lottie and the other Wood daughter, Libby, desperately soaked burlap grain sacks in water troughs and hauled them to the field where the workers tried to extinguish the flames by beating at them with the wet bags. To no avail. The fire burned the entire grain crop and pasture of Woodside Ranch. As Charlotte wrote about her father and brother, imagine how they felt. When they left, the wheat and barley were waving in the morning breeze. When they returned, 3 black hills met their gaze instead of the 6-foot-tall waving grain. They expected 3,000 sacks of grain, but harvested only 30. It was a total loss since they had no fire insurance. They must have been quite beloved in the community because a surprise donation party was arranged by their Grange friends. They were overwhelmed with the display of generosity, for without those agricultural donations, Woodside Farm would have been ruined. Clearly, fire has been a major concern in the valley throughout our history. This is a photo of Charles and Cynthia celebrating their 50th anniversary in 1907. Charles and Cynthia's son, Charles J., was also a Grange master, and their daughter Libby was a Grange secretary for 15 years. Their other daughter, Charlotte, was a student at Sycamore School and a beloved teacher there for 31 years, from 1890 to 1921. She joined the Grange at just 15 years old and was a member for an amazing 75 years. She was a poet and a chronicler of the Valley and Woodside Ranch history. Charlotte Wood Middle School is named after her. She died in 1961 at the age of 97. Charlotte Wood wrote this about the Danville, Alamo area. The attractions and advantages of city surroundings were no lure from the freedom, wholesome pleasures, and vigorous health of our tree-embowered birthplace. Apparently, the Woods were activist nature lovers. In the 1920s, several Wood family members were involved in promoting public access to Mount Diablo State Park. George Wood, in particular, attended meetings, led hikes on the mountain, and helped survey land to facilitate the purchase by the state of California. The park was expanded and opened to the public in 1931. The first few times I visited the cemetery, I tiptoed around very carefully, trying not to step on the grave sites. But as you can see, the path sometimes peter out in a pioneer cemetery like this, which forces you to gently walk over the grave sites. I've been assured by our historians that respectful sidestepping is okay if you come to a dead end. No pun intended. This is where the Humburgs lie. It's a grand family plot surrounded by ornate fencing, fit for one of the earliest successful pioneering families in the valley. Frederick Lorenz Humburg migrated from Germany to work in the gold mines before moving to Alamo in 1853. 10 years later, he married Maria Kornmann, who also came from Germany. Frederick was a skilled harness maker and businessman. They lived in Alamo until 1876 and then spent some time back in Germany and San Francisco before purchasing a 116-acre ranch here and settling for good here in 1879. This is a photo of the Humburg house overlooking Alamo with Jones Ranch in the background backing up to Las Trompas. It was a small community and the Humburg family was linked in marriage to other well-known families, including the Stones from Alamo and the Olsons from San Ramon. Frederick and Maria's son, August Humburg, raced his horse, Humburg Belle, at the Oakwood track. This buggy, with a Humburg house in the background, shows the typical way people traveled in the 19th century. August married Annie Alice Stone in 1893. As you can imagine, there were many marriages between neighbors in those days, the classic boy next door marries girl next door. August had a blacksmith shop in Alamo and served on the SRV High School Board of Trustees in 1917. August and Annie had two children, daughter Friedrich and son Lorenz. In 1894, August and Annie built this Victorian house on Orchard Court in Alamo. Pictured here is their daughter Friedrich and Annie holding their baby son Lorenz. August Humburg built a third home in Alamo, which was located on a knoll where CVS is now. This house was demolished when the knoll was flattened in the 1960s. Another Humburg home on Orchard Court was built in about 1893 and was moved to Donala Farms on Danville Boulevard in the 1980s. August and Annie's son Lorenz married Astrid Olson, who was from another pioneering family and graduated with the first all-girl graduating class of SRV High School in 1914. Here are Lorenz and Astrid with their two daughters, Norma and Betty. Betty is still actively involved with the Valley's history at the museum. Here on the back side of the cemetery is a wall of niches for cremated remains. As I mentioned, no burial sites are available, just these niches. If you're interested in more information, you may contact Patricia Howard with the Alamo Lafayette Cemetery District. For niche interments, one of the requirements is that people must live in an area based on the original 19th century Alamo, Danville, Green Valley, and Sycamore Grammar School districts, with the exact boundaries established in a 1937 tax district. It's interesting to note that these boundaries originated with grammar school districts established in the 1860s and 70s. There were 6 of these districts, but neither San Ramon nor Tassajara were included in the cemetery boundaries. People living there were often buried in the Dublin Pioneer Cemetery. Bollinger Family headstones. Bollinger Canyon and Bollinger Canyon Road are familiar landmarks for Valley residents today. They're named for the pioneer Joshua Bollinger, who was born in Bollinger County, Missouri. It's interesting to note the various spellings of the same family name, sometimes with one L and sometimes with two. Apparently, the pioneers weren't as particular about spelling back then as we are today. Joshua Bollinger had 5 children with his first wife in Missouri and 7 children with his second wife, Catherine. He migrated to California in 1850, where he mined and farmed. I'm not sure where his first 5 children lived during this time, perhaps with relatives back in Missouri. Joshua returned to Missouri briefly and married his second wife, Catherine, in 1854. Then he moved back to California with Catherine, where they lived in Santa Clara before moving to the Valley in 1855 and taking up residence in the canyon that now bears his name. In 1866, he bought a farm of 283 acres in Alamo, where he was evidently quite prosperous. His son Joseph then lived in the canyon property at that time. This is Joseph Bollinger and his crew at Bollinger Ranch with the threshing machines. Joseph looks ever the part of the man in charge in the middle left. Bollinger Canyon from Crow Canyon Road dead ends in the Las Trampas Regional Wilderness today, but in the 1800s, a road went entirely through the canyon to Moraga. It was a good link for early American families constructing homes and buildings in the south part of the San Ramon Valley. The redwood trees west of Moraga were the best and closest source of redwood, a building material which was highly valued for its resilience and insect resistance. It's also interesting to note that on the western side of Bollinger Canyon, a number of caves have been carved in the sandstone. According to Howard Ferrero, one of them has the initials and date W. Bollinger, 1871. You hear a lot about Native American cave drawings, but this was the first I've heard of pioneer graffiti. And speaking of caves, here's a photo of some of the Wood family members in a cave. Outings up into the hills and the caves were popular activities with the pioneers. As we continue up the path, we come upon the Chrisman family plot here at the top of the knoll. It's the cemetery's first official grave site, that of 6-year-old Callie Chrisman, who died in 1856. It's sad to look at the graves of the little ones, but the harsh reality is that children's deaths were fairly common in those days. As you walk through the cemetery, you'll notice a number of babies and children's graves, often marked with the statues of lambs or inscriptions like 5-year-old Leonard Harrington's headstone that says, "Somebody's little darling slumbers here." Unfortunately, we know much more than that about little Callie, other than the fact that she had 2 brothers and 1 sister. We do know that her parents, John and Barbara, arrived in Danville in 1851 and are counted as some of the Valley's earliest pioneers. Here are a couple of maps of Rancho San Ramon as it was laid out in 1874, highlighting the properties of familiar pioneering names. If you look closely, you can see the Chrisman's 2 plots, as well as the Boone, Baldwin, and Cox plots, among others. Off to the left here are the more niches that are mostly filled at this point. And then we will slightly sidestep our way through to the Baldwin's lovely family plot. The Baldwin brothers were among the first American pioneers who were founders of post-gold rush communities throughout the Bay Area. Here is a photo of two of our museum docents representing the illustrious Baldwin family. Robert O. was the first Baldwin settler in the valley in 1852. He and his brother John came from Ohio in 1850 with a group of 200 men who planned to mine for gold in Placerville and the Feather River area, with the goal of, as they said, to better their situations. They ended up buying land in the San Ramon Valley with their mining profits. R.O. eventually owned 900 acres of prime valley land in Danville. He wrote this in the Contra Costa Gazette. I thought the valley was a Garden of Eden when I moved here, and I never had any reason to change my mind. In the History of Contra Costa County, R.O. also wrote, the land in the valley is unsurpassed by any in the state. An entire failure of a crop has never been known. Corn grows very well there, and most every variety of fruit is raised in abundance. Grain and stock is the principal business depended upon for a livelihood. In 1858, R.O. married Mary Cox, who had moved to the valley with her parents and 6 siblings in 1853. They had 6 children and were one of 6 couples who celebrated their golden anniversary in the first decade of the 20th century. R.O. prospered, eventually having a spread of 1,700 acres south of Danville. The rich land produced every variety of produce, including pears, sugar beets, and walnuts. He also ran stock and raised hogs. As a well-known farmer, Robert was a founding member of the Grange in 1873. This is a classic photo of pioneer men at a picnic. There's a lot of talk about the Grange in our valley history. The purpose of a Grange was to unite and educate farmers and improve rural economic conditions. As Inez Butts wrote in History of the Danville Grange, into this dull life of the farmer and his family, the Grange brought social contacts, news of the outside world, and the pleasure of laughing, talking, and eating with new and old friends and neighbors. Programs were an established item in the order of business, and people who never had spoken, sung, or debated before an audience could now have that opportunity and experience. A Grange Hall was built in Danville in 1874 and became the heart of the valley's economic, social, and political life. We can be proud that the Danville Grange in particular recognized the importance of women in the community, immediately granting them full voting membership. In fact, 10 of the 30 charter members were women. Okay, back to the Baldwins with a drawing of their extensive property. Robert Baldwin was also a trustee of the Danville Presbyterian Church and one of the first trustees of Danville Grammar School. He was admired as a scientific farmer as he experimented with new crops such as beets and planted thousands of fruit trees long before the Southern Pacific train arrived in 1891. His flag stop on the Southern Pacific line was called Osage Station, named for the Osage trees he planted. Of course, we now know it as Osage Station Park. The Baldwin home pictured here was a 2-story house built in 1888, and it stood until 1953 when it burned down. The palm trees which framed the house can still be seen along El Capitan Drive. Baldwin Ranch was sold in the 1960s and developed into Danville Station. R.O. and Mary's great-grandson, John F. Baldwin, was a U.S. congressman for the San Ramon Valley in the 1960s. Baldwin Drive is named for the family, and Baldwin Elementary School in Danville is named after John, who actually isn't buried here. He's buried at the Oakmont Cemetery in Lafayette. Now we'll wind our way along Oak Avenue to the last stop of our tour. Meandering along like this is a good time to observe the artistry of the headstones. As you can imagine, there's a whole list of graveyard symbols and their meanings. Around here, you'll see a lot of engraved flowers, which in general are a symbol of friendship, love, and truth. Specific flowers have different meanings. For example, calla lilies indicate marriage, daffodils symbolize the death of youth, grace, and beauty, daisies stand for innocence and purity of thought, roses are a sign of perfection or completion, and ivy represents faithfulness and friendship. There are many crosses on headstones, of course, as a symbol of faith, as well as many lambs indicating innocence and gentleness. There's a predominance of oak trees in this area. Acorns represent strength and potential, while oak leaves represent strength and a ripe old age. Here we are at the Jones family gravesite. This is a true pioneering family with multiple headstones just on the other side of the obelisk. But the modesty of the patriarch and the matriarch is evident by their headstones, which are marked with simple initials, JMJ and MAJ. The Jones family members were some of the earliest settlers in Alamo, arriving in 1851, and both John and Mary Ann contributed significantly to that first settlement. They had 9 children and were big proponents of education. They initiated early schools and boarded the first teachers at their home. John was the first postmaster from 1852 to 1861, began Cumberland Presbyterian Church, and helped found the Union Academy High School. John was also the county school superintendent, the justice of peace, the county assessor, and an early member of the Masonic Lodge. Mary Ann was a remarkable woman in her own right. She was devout, modest, smart, and resolute. John got sick on their trip to California in 1846, so Mary Ann learned to drive the wagon. Accounts of their long trip and the challenges they and many pioneers overcame are awe-inspiring. They passed the Donner Party and just missed the early Sierra snowfalls of 1846. In January 1847, Mary Ann gave birth to her 3rd child, and in her account of the trip, she didn't even mention that she was pregnant. Those pioneer women were amazingly stoic. So this is Mary Ann with her daughter and most likely 2 granddaughters and her great-granddaughter toward the end of her industrious life. Mary Ann was a charter member of the Grange in 1873 and was an active member throughout her long life. She was also a Sunday school teacher in the Presbyterian Church and wrote an autobiography. In addition, Mary Ann helped with the post office when John was not in town. In her diary, she wrote, "I took care of the office. Many times men would come and get their mail and sit and read and talk until I felt like saying, 'Do go, I have to work.' We had no stamps then, nor envelopes. We wrote out letters, folded and sealed them with sealing wax, and then paid 10 cents for delivery. We had mail twice a week." Gosh, it was a much simpler time and yet much more tedious in many ways. And how much we take for granted our daily mail delivery today. This is docent Carmen Curtis on one of the spring cemetery tours. Carmen is always a ringer for Mary Ann Jones and a force in her own right too. She's one of the museum founders and a longtime docent. Notice the daffodils and iris that grace the cemetery here. In October, the cemetery is dry and dusty, but on our May tours, it springs to life with greenery and flowers. This concludes our cemetery tour, but there are plenty of more grave sites to explore. If you do visit the cemetery on your own, be sure to wear your sturdy shoes and bring your imagination along with your respect for these hardy pioneers who created this wonderful Tri-Valley community that we live in now. So we hope you enjoyed the cemetery experience and maybe even felt a sense of the olden days. I am struck by the stories of history repeating itself. Albert Stone built a cabin on his ranch to homeschool his children and the neighbors' children, just as some people are turning their backyard guest houses into makeshift classrooms for the social learning pods. Fire burned down the Stone family home and ravaged the Woods family ranch, just as fire is raging through Northern California every year. Members of the Grange generously donated to help the Woods with their loss of everything on their farm, just as kind citizens today go fund the victims of the fires. Disagreements over the Civil War created political and social tensions, even in the serene San Ramon Valley here, just as the protests and social unrests of this year are unfolding. And the resilience of the pioneers is really remarkable and helped them overcome so many difficulties and create this amazing community that we call home, which gives me hope that we too can overcome all the tumultuous times that our country is facing right now. There was a true sense of community among the pioneers that settled here, and they always looked out for one another. As one pioneer said, it was hard to get away with anything since everyone knew everyone else. I seem to recall my son saying the exact same thing when he was growing up around here. At any rate, time marches on, the issues evolve, but at the core of it all, I believe that our sense of community is just as strong and vital as it's always been. So now we can turn this over to questions that any of you viewers may have. I probably won't know many of the answers, but we have a ringer on hand. One of our museum founders and local historians, Beverly Lane, is on hand for any stumpers that you might throw at us. She can probably answer any question in the book since she's already written 2 local history books and has another one in the works. So Dan, if you'd like to open this up for questions, well, we'll have at it.
Okay. Thanks, Jana. Nicely done. A couple questions, and actually one I'm going to answer right now. Someone asked about tours of the cemetery, and my advice is to just keep checking the museum's homepage. We will post our tours there, and if you're really lucky, you can get the person that actually was online today. Look for Jana. She'll do an excellent job for you, but all of our docents that handle our cemetery tours are terrific. Jana, I don't know if you can answer this one, but there was a question about how many people are buried in the site.
I can't answer that.
That's what I figured.
A basic question I should know.
But we could lead into this one because you can answer this. You had mentioned that the cemetery for ground burials was at capacity, but can you go over the niches again?
Well, there are, it looks like quite a few available for Valley residents who live in those designated areas that are based on the old tax districts or school districts. So I don't know all the particular requirements. I would recommend contacting Patricia Howard with the Alamo Lafayette Cemetery District. And I believe you can find that number online anywhere, or you can contact the museum for all the particulars, because I'm not really sure what the requirements are and what it takes, but I do know that they are available for cremated remains.
Okay. You had talked about some of the symbolism and artistry, was the word I'll refer to, and I think you did as well, on the headstones, symbols of flowers and lambs for young burials. There is a popular gravestone rubbing where you can go and actually take some of the images by using paper and pen off the gravestones. Can you talk about that a little bit too?
Yeah, in fact, I had communicated with Patricia Howard about that a while ago because I was wondering if, are we allowed to do that? And yes, it is permissible to do that at our Pioneer Cemetery, but she did strongly advise that we use only the flat gravestones rather than the upright ones. They're it's an old cemetery and we don't want the pressure to topple the headstones. So focus on the ones that are flat on the ground. As far as the technique, no expert on that, but I think the weight of like a light wrapping paper, maybe the underside of the wrapping paper can be used, or something of that similar, even lightweight copy paper or tracing paper if you have a gentle hand. It's recommended that you use masking tape to tape it on, no other kind of tape. We also do not recommend doing any kind of cleaning of the headstones. You can brush off a little dirt, but don't try to scrub them down. The stones are old and relatively fragile. So, and as far as what you use to rub, I know there's like a rubbing wax that you can get at an art supply store. There's also like a lumberman's chalk that you could use. You could probably use a big fat crayon or big fat kid's chalk if you wanted. I don't know. There's probably some great articles online that say exact techniques, but it is permissible with extreme caution. So
yeah, it's funny you mentioned that, because as you and I have talked, these headstones look very permanent, but after 100 years or so out in the weather, they get pretty fragile too. So if anybody's doing a gravestone rubbing, I think the horizontal stones are great. The vertical stones, you got to be very careful with.
Definitely.
Okay, that's all of the questions. I do have to say something to our audience. We apologize a little bit. I mentioned that we had a large audience. There were a number of students on our presentation today. And students, I've taught a lot of them, and they get chatty. And so if you were a bit taken aback by the chat, we apologize for that. And I actually do have another question that just came in. Can you just go over the earliest date, which is the Callie Chrisman plot? And as far as I know, since people are still being buried in the niches, there is no more close date to where we are today. But if you can just repeat the Callie Chrisman portion of this, that'd be great.
Yeah, that was in 1856. And like we said, there were probably other burials that happened before that. We know of that one, I think his name was Thomas Monroe, that was buried, but it's an unmarked grave. So the first marked grave is Callie Chrisman in 1856, and sad, she was only 6 years old. So
yeah, I can say the same thing. Some of them, and we encourage people to go look at these. Some of them, especially the very young children, but that was the way the world was. Infant mortality was high, and childhood mortality was high. Mm-hmm. So yeah, some of them are particularly sad. You had said that as well. And I think I can agree with that. It's just the way things were.
Yeah.
So that's it for questions, Jana. Thank you. And I have a few thank yous to make. First of all, I want to thank Jana for the research and her presentation, and her willingness to walk up stone steps backwards, wearing 19th century shoes. I'm glad she survived it. Thank you to Cassidy Clark, who is the filmmaker extraordinaire for this. I want to thank the Alamo Lafayette Cemetery District for their support of the museums interpreting the site. And all of you, I want to thank you for viewing this morning. If you've missed any of our programs, you can find them by visiting the museum's website at museumsrv.org. And today's program will reappear in about a week. Our next program will be on Thursday, November 19th at 11:30. And you've seen the tower. If you've been to Land's End in San Francisco, you know the baths. Deanna Conkey from the Sutro Library will tell us the fascinating story of Adolf Sutro, who goes from German immigrant to Comstock Lode Riches to San Francisco politician and philanthropist. If you like these programs and you want them to continue, we ask that you make a donation by going to the museum's homepage, museumsrv.org, and clicking on the Donate Now button. I thank you for watching this morning. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Stay safe, and thank you for watching.